Evening all, welcome along. So great to have you with us. Session 5, our last session, Jess.
I know.
Our last session, we've done it. Our thanks always to Cumbria Woodland and to Forestry Commission for funding this and putting it on and having us. We've got a lot to get through, as always. And as we go through today, use the chat, get involved, introduce yourselves and put questions in there as we're going through, as you're watching different bits and pieces. Any questions you've got, absolutely put them in there. We'll collect them all and we'll have 2 different Q&A sessions partway through and one at the end as well. And feedback, that's the other thing that we must remember.
Please.
We need it. It's really, really important. This is an innovative new thing that we're trialling and we're really, really keen to know how it's landing, what's working, what isn't. So please feedback. 48 hours you've got, isn't it?
Yeah,
after this session. So if you are watching this in the future and 48 hours is gone since the 9th of December, you might not be able to use that form, but anyone who's here tonight and for the next 48 hours to get it in. And the other thing was learning management system. So Cumbria Woodlands have got their brand new learning management system up and running. So that's where all of these are going to be hosted. So you can go to Cumbria Woodlands and I think there's a link below,
isn't there? There's a link just down there, yeah.
Don't know where down there is, but it's below. And I think that's all of the intro and hello for me so far. I'll hand over to Jez.
Awesome, thanks Kat. It's Tale of Two Halves this evening, I think. We sort of wanted to wrap everything up, but there's such a big area that we haven't covered yet, and that's looking at products and services and how to use your woodland to gain an income, and we're going to look at that in a minute, and that'll take up sort of the first half, 2/3 of tonight's sessions, and then we're going to have a complete change and we're going to look at where you can go next, further training, whether you're just interested or whether you want to go into it professionally, and we're going to look at potential careers and how you get into forestry as a career. And then finally we're going to sort of wrap up and conclude, and in amongst all that, like Kath said, loads of Q&A, loads of questions. Please ask questions, easy questions. So to start with, I'm sorry about the paper, you can hear it, can't you? We are going to start looking at products and services, and it's I think it's worth bearing in mind straight from the start here that, there's a lot of people have an attitude that once you start talking about timber in the woodlands, you're talking about huge, big Sitka spruce plantations and a very harshly commercial way of doing forestry. And for some people and in some places, that's the right thing to do and it's what they want to do. And, perhaps the land can't be used for anything else and we need volume commodity timber. But in a lot of places and for a lot of people, those products and services can be a much softer way of doing things, and we're going to look at some of those. But I think it's also important to remember that everything we've talked about in the last few weeks, and whether it's managing for ecosystem services or for people or whatever it's for, somehow it all needs paying for. And what we're going to look at this evening is, whether you want to manage your woodlands to be productive to bring you a profit, or whether you want to manage them to bring in some income to help you manage them better and better in the future, doesn't really matter. It's still sort of finance in, and that's what we're going to try and look at. And it's, there's an old adage in forestry that's just drummed into you again and again and university, is that the woods that pay are the woods that stay. And the fact is, unless there is some income derived from the woodlands, it's very difficult to make them stay in good condition. And a lot of the reason so many woodlands are out of condition or badly managed or completely unmanaged is because there's no income being derived from them. And so it's about balancing that income and that ecological management of the woodland. So we're going to start tonight by the most traditional products from the woodland, and that is timber, and we're best placed to start than go into the woods and have a look. We're standing in the middle of a stand of Western red cedar, and Western red cedar is an incredibly useful timber to grow. It's highly durable, it's well sought after, but it requires some careful thought when you're growing it. And a lot of that is some of the things we'll see throughout this series, the soils, the spacing, the way it grows. And one thing that we can't control in our management is the genetics of the tree. And almost all the trees around us are very similar to this. And the problem is that the genetic stock that these seeds came from gives very heavily fluted trees, and you can see that here. And these flutings are incredibly important for the tree, and Western red seed relies on them to stand up in a storm, to give it strength. But what we want is genetic stock where the flutings don't go so deeply into the tree. And finding that right genetic stock is difficult, possible, and it's about discussions with the nursery you get the trees from. It's about looking for seed stock that other people have planted that is doing well. And what we'd really ideally like here is a tree that has a bit less fluting. All Western red seed is going to have some, but also a bit less side branching and a little less taper. And though we can see the tree is really wide at the bottom here and very quickly goes fairly narrow. And so we're reducing the amount of timber we get out of this tree probably by 50%, just because the genetics of the seed were wrong. Timber has a myriad of uses, and it's a sort of compromise between what markets you want to sell into, what markets are good at the moment, and what diameter and height your timber is at. Whether you're thinning, whether you're harvesting, all those things that we discussed last week are eventually leading to a market for your timber. And so we can look, for instance, in this loading bay where the timber's been harvested and forwarded, all that stuff we discussed last week, and it's divided up into a whole number of products. And low diameter timber can be used for firewood, it can be used for what we call bars, so it could go into fencing posts and strainers, or it could be used as pallet wood. And as the timber gets bigger, it becomes what we call saw logs. And some saw logs, for instance in upland spruce plantations, can be as little as 28 centimetres, but in other applications can be much, much larger. If we have a look at this bay at a sawmill, we can see some huge logs, and you need to be kind of quite careful with this. The idea of growing very large diameter trees is hugely attractive, not just for the ecology and the aesthetics of the woodland, but also for timber quality. But actually there's often very few mills that'll take this kind of material. Often they're local and require more detailed selling and contact with the miller itself. So the logs are at the loading bay and they come and get collected, and it's now a point of how you saw these. And I suppose there's two types of sawmill really. First of all, there's small mobile sawmills that are often used by local sawmillers or local arboriculturalists. And these are great if you have low volumes of timber, perhaps you don't have a full lorry load of timber, they can come on site, and if you've got storage, they can saw it for you. You can keep it what we call in stick to dry out and possibly sell it as dry timber. But if you've got large amounts of timber, then multiple loads for instance, then it's likely to go to a much bigger mill. And these mills are often very focused in what they'll take. So if you're up in Scotland, the very big mills might only take conifer up to 28 centimetres diameter. But if you're at Mike's sawmill, where we are now, then these sawmills can take very large diameter timber. And Mike, for instance, specialises in very high quality hardwoods and softwoods. But when we're looking at timber, it's not just about this sort of beautiful, straight, knot-free trees and timber that we think of as the absolute focus of what we're growing. Sometimes quality can be found in circumstances that you don't normally think of. Trees that are seemingly visually of low quality can often have very good niche applications. So for instance, trees with big bends on them can often be used by timber framers or boat builders. But let's go and have a look now into the forest and have a look at some gnarled old oak. Although we think of quality timber and quality trees as those perfectly cylindrical trees without a blemish on them, actually, especially in broadleaf woodlands and ancient semi-natural woodlands, these trees that look somehow quite ugly and warty can provide some of the highest quality and highest value you can get out of the tree. And these are burrs in the tree, and they will create what we call bur oak, which is highly prized by furniture makers. All of this sort of hairy branching here, this is called epicormic shooting, and there's many reasons you get epicormic shooting, but in fact what it does is to create what we call pippy oak, another very high value timber in the tree. And as we're talking about timber, it's given me an opportunity to break out some timber samples that have been gathering dust for the last 2 years, because I'm never allowed to go out and take them with me to teach with at the moment. And it's probably worth going through them because it's quite instructive as we're thinking about value and products and how you want to manage your woodland for different types of timber products, because some are more valuable for us than others, some easier to grow than others. But actually let's start with this actually, which is piece of eucalyptus. It's obviously you can't feel how heavy it is. It's incredibly light. This is about 4 or 5 years growth, and the trees are about 40 or 50 foot tall. And this of course is perfect firewood size. Now it requires very little processing. If you're a firewood processor, it can come down, it can get converted to chip, and it grows incredibly fast. And actually, you know, if what's important to you is biomass production, then this might be an option. And it's the other side of the coin is that to grow eucalyptus, we tend to grow it incredibly intensively. So, you know, getting good ecological conditions in that eucalyptus plantation, you know, as we've seen, can be done, but sometimes it's quite difficult, and there's a balance to be made. So within your woodland management, we looked at silviculture a few weeks ago. It may be that you're creating that little matrix of different woodland types in your woodland, of which growing firewood on a short rotation in quite an intensive way might form a part of, and it's not particularly different from the old coppice with standard systems that we now see as very ecologically sensitive ways of managing. But generally what we're trying to do is grow sawn timber, and you know, what we're trying to do as foresters is to grow logs like this. And I think we looked a few weeks ago at the hardwood and the softwood, and yeah, we're trying to get big long straight logs. Well, the sort of problem with this is that these trees standing up, you know, this is only a small one, even if it's double this size, per cubic metre might be worth about £40 a cubic metre standing in the forest, and then either you or someone else has to pay to get it taken down, and once it's taken down you have to bring it to roadside, and everything's incurring costs. And part of the problem is that every single time you touch it, it is doubling in value. So if we sort of turn this round, you know, once this becomes a sawn board here, you know, this is nothing particularly interesting. It's just a standard dimension sawn board out of the log, and sort of around today's price, this will be sort of £400 cubic metre. So it's increased in value by 10 times, you know, just by taking it from this to this. And it's probably quite difficult to see now, but the end of this is laminated, so it's been, you can just perhaps just about see it, it's been cut up and glued back together, and it's made what we call cross-laminated timber, and just that simple act of taking it apart, gluing it back together makes a much more dimensionally stable product. And suddenly this is worth about 1,500 cubic meters. So you as the forest owner or manager is getting £40 for that, but the person that's making it into this is getting £1,500. And it's a question in your forest management of how far you want to take it. You might decide that actually investing in this sort of production is a better way of investing your money than in this part of it. Or you might decide that actually just, this is a piece of very bog standard softwood, there's nothing special about it at all, it's dead easy to grow, you put it in the ground, it grows, you take it out, and you might decide actually £40 a cubic metre on a 30 or 40 year rotation isn't for you at all. Actually, you might think, well, actually what I want is much better quality timber, and so you might decide to grow hardwoods, for instance. And there's a lot of problems. We must have discussed squirrels endlessly over the last 5 weeks, and knottiness and how to grow good timber. But you can grow good timber in this country, and you can grow good hardwoods if you are really careful about it, but it is difficult. To produce this is relatively easy. To produce this is relatively difficult, but the returns are much greater. And actually, whilst this sawn board, softwood board, is perhaps worth £400 a cubic metre, these are worth about £4,000 a cubic metre. And these are, it's difficult to show in the camera, these are all ash, beech, what else have we got here, chestnut, maple, oak, sycamore. They're all very conventional species. Sycamore we think of as a pest from a woodland management, or used to, but actually produces a very beautiful timber. And the fact is that all these timbers in fact came actually from urban settings in the middle of London. Every single piece of these very good quality hardwoods came from central London, zone 1, and if you can get out of zone 1, you can get that out of your woodland as well. But it's about, you have to prioritise those objectives right at the point where you're deciding how to manage your woodland. These woodland products might be 30 or 40 or 50 years away, but you need to decide 30 or 40 or 50 years in advance that you want to produce good quality sawn timber. And that needs to be written into a management plan, as we've talked about in past sessions. So sawn timber isn't the only type of product from a woodland. Increasingly, people are taking other products, foods, fungi, anything that's a sort of, a product, anything that you pick up, take out, sell for some cash, or use for yourselves. And these non-timber forest products, we actually just refer to as non-timber forest products, NTFPs, pretty boringly. And in a lot of the world, they're very large economies in these, not so much in this country, but it is worth you thinking about whether this is a direction you want to go down. And it's worth thinking about what it does to the ecology of the woodland, how you can manage this. Do you want to intensively raise fungi in your woodland, or blueberries, that we're going to have a look at in a minute? And do you want this to be a saleable commodity, or do you want it to be something that people just forage for? And then the other way of looking at these non-timber forest products that is very important to mention is, if you're the type of people that go out and forage for fungi or fruit or whatever it is in the woodland, then you need to think carefully about how much you take, because these are very natural systems, and you can degrade them very easily, especially when we're talking about fungi, which at the end of the day provide they're almost the lifeblood of the woodland, underneath the soils and above the soils. So let's go into the woods and let's just take a look at some of these non-timber forest products. We came out to these rich, ancient woodlands with good acid soils to film ancient woodlands for this series, and what we found was the last remnants of the blueberries or blaeberries or whatever you want to call them, and they demonstrate a really good example of how diverse and rich in food a woodland can be. And it's interesting that, you know, we can pick these personally and stuff ourselves. There's so many of them, but it'd be interesting to think about the opportunities of using these commercially. And it's one of these examples where fruit is originally a woodland shade tolerant species that we now force to grow in big open fields and have to adapt them for that, but could possibly be better grown in the forest. And here's another example of non-timber forest products. In this case, it's a chestnut orchard, and what this shows are chestnuts that we would never want to take for timber. In fact, they're a very specific for hybrid of chestnuts, of sweet chestnuts, that are made for fruiting and for collection. So they're big wide branches, they have a large open crown, and it's important, if you are moving into this kind of orchard or fruit type of system, that you pick the right habitat, the right hybrids for what you want to do. And as an extreme example of this non-timber forest products, we can look into a forest garden, and this is a new type of silvicultural system, certainly in the UK, and this is on the Dartington estate, and there are probably about 100 edible species in this space, and it's made up of a proper woodland system, but everything in it is focused and has a purpose. So there are Italian alder that are providing the big trees that hopefully future timber trees. There are a mid layer of fruit and nut varieties, and then there's this very vitally important herb layer that we kind of just missed because we were filming in autumn, that provides not just soil health but also the pollination opportunities for insects, especially bees. And finally, whilst we're looking at this non-timber forest product sort of section, let's sort of look into the future. And here we are in a eucalyptus plantation, and eucalyptus is interesting that it can be grown sort of industrially, but it can also be grown in a very considered way. It's incredibly fast growing, and people think of it as a biomass crop, but actually here what we're seeing is a great green sward of grass underneath it, and it's entirely possible for us to start putting cattle or sheep under here to feed on the grass sward. And then even going a step further, let's look at these leaves and this bark. The whole forest smells of eucalyptus, and so one of the things we're doing at Timber Strategies at the moment is working with the university to take these leaves and this bark and seeing if we can extract essential oils from them. And this whole area of biodistillation may be a huge future potential opportunity, especially for small woods and what we think of as low value woodlands.
So we've covered getting products from the land and harvesting in all these different ways. Now that might not be something that you're interested in. You might not want to be just producing timber from the woodland that you've got, woodland that you manage. And we've also covered recreation in other sessions a little bit, and we're sort of looping back around to it now, but more in the realm of a paid service. So, you know, if you're thinking of bike tracks, or maybe forest schools using, or local communities, there's loads of different ways that those sort of paid services can come in. And those services, although I've said paid, you know, they can be free if you want to be more down that altruistic route of looking after your woodland that way. They don't have to be a paid for service. There's lots of different things that can look like. So we're going to get straight back into some video now, and we're going to talk a bit more about some of those services. So we've talked about recreation in previous episodes, and we're just coming back to it today to think of it as a paid service. And there are a myriad of ways that people want to and like using the woodland. And as we've said in the past, it's a hugely rewarding thing to do, to open up a woodland for people to see it and use it and to get benefit from it. And that includes walkers, it includes horse riders, mountain bikers, but it also includes things like forest schools, for instance, where children are taken out of the classroom for a short amount of time and they're allowed to sit by a fire, they get to whittle sticks, they can go for a wee in the woods and do all those things that they can't do in the classroom, but puts them straight into nature. And to do this, you need to make sure that you have the right infrastructure in place. So there's a physical infrastructure that you will need, and that includes some types of parking that might be that you're using loading bays when they're not being used for timber extraction, for example, or you could close car parks for timber extraction the other way around. So, you've got flexible spaces, but you'll need these in because having people park on curbsides and edges and lanes and things, generally is fairly antagonistic to local community. And then moving in from that, you're going to need footpaths or you need tracks for people to use, and they need to not conflict with other woodland maintenance tasks or working groups or contractors and stuff in the woodland. Signposting is often really useful because most people think they might know their way around the woodland. Actually, it can be really easy to get lost. And then, the other infrastructure that you need is all in the paperwork, really, in the background. And whilst it might sound a bit boring, liability is really, really important. So if you are an owner, you're liable for anything that happens in that woodland. And it's important that you have appropriate insurance in place. So it's important that if you have a lot of users, that you carry out regular tree inspections. And this is especially true along footpaths, bridleways, and those official rights of way. But once all those things are in place, it's kind of up to you how you manage that. So you may want to leave people to discover the woodlands on their own. You may want to put signs in, you might want to put display boards in, or you might even want to charge people. You might want to put pay and display car parks in, or maybe you ask for donations. But however you do it, if you're an owner or a manager, I'd really urge you to go down this route if possible and work with users rather than with against them. And within this section, there's a whole area of woodland ownership and woodland use that we haven't really considered at all, and that's community. Woodlands, community-owned woodland, community-leased woodland, and they are a rich, diverse resource in the UK, and they tend to be small woodlands on the periphery of habitations. Often rural villages or towns might have a small community woodland. Sometimes these are owned by the community. Other times it's ground that maybe has a long-term lease or a contract with a landowner about how the woodlands are managed. And they provide a huge number of benefits to the local community. Part of it is a place to walk, for the community to feel like they have ownership of. Partly, it could be run by volunteers working in the woodland, and sometimes it's about having some small resource. So often in community woodland there are community firewood schemes, for instance, where those in the community and actively involved in the woodland have a right then to take some of the firewood from that in some ways. And it goes right back to the very start of session 1, where we were talking about estovers and the right to firewood and to simple building repair materials from the woodland. And it's worth saying that broad community woodland is a very different thing, and they are often very large forests on the edge of town that might provide income for town council for the local community. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for getting involved and throwing questions in the chat. Are you ready? We're going to go straight into it. Okay, let's do it. So William had a question. He's saying forest research says that woodlands have saved £141 million in costs associated with stuff like mental health, visits to GPs, well-being, all that kind of stuff. He's saying, how can you get your woodland prescribed? Can you talk around that?
How can you get your woodland prescribed? It's something we haven't really talked about a lot, is these sort of incidental savings to things like the NHS and to employers as well in time saved. If people feel healthier for walking in the woods. They're likely to have less days off work, they're likely to go to their doctor and be prescribed pharmaceuticals. And I suppose the question is, how can woodlands and outdoor physical access be a prescribed activity? It's something that always seems to be on the cusp of breaking into the mainstream and never quite making it. And we've certainly had discussions with our local GP surgery about this sort of green gym and green prescribing. It would be great if it was mainstreamed within the NHS, but quite how you fill in the right forms for NICE to approve it as a sort of pseudo-pharmaceutical, I have no idea, but it is certainly something we ought to be duty-bound to be looking at.
Yeah, maybe that's coming then, slowly but surely. So, Andy had a question about timber production, and he's saying if you've got a small, if you're doing small scale kind of woodland stuff, is timber production possible there? Does it need to be a large scale?
The number of times we have this conversation, in fact I've had this conversation with someone today, and probably yesterday, and probably the day before that, and the day before that, and the answers are complicated yes and no. We are lucky enough to live in Devon, and we can get on the ferry in Plymouth and go over the channel to France, and you cycle off the ferry, and within a couple of kilometres you are seeing very small blocks of very high quality timber, oak and sweet chestnut, growing in immaculate way. And there's reasons for that, and part of it is about the wood culture in France and Napoleonic laws that favour growing very good quality timber, and a lot of it's the fact they don't have grey squirrels, but actually they can do it, and with enough care we can grow good timber in very small parcels. But the other side to that is that there's huge amounts of farm woodland in very small blocks throughout the UK, and generally they're in areas that are inaccessible, or they're steep slopes, no tracks to them. They've been out of management for so long that there might only be one or two good stems of timber in there, and actually you could take those out, but the cost of doing that is going to be disproportionate to what you're going to get for them. And those woodlands need a complete transformation sometimes, and that transformation doesn't have to be in some harsh industrialized way. It can be done sensitively, but it's going to take time. And so generally I'm going to say something now that's probably going to annoy quite a lot of people. Foresters, in my opinion, anything under 3 or 4 hectares is difficult to manage for good timber in this country. Once you get to 7 or 8 hectares, then you can be totally honest, and you can get enough volume to make it efficient to do it. And it's about having the right amount of volume, which is related to value, to get out and get that timber out. But you can manage small woodlands. I mean, we run projects in the middle of London where we're taking out individual trees and getting great timber out of them.
That's what I'm wondering. Is it more a case of you just wouldn't be relying solely on timber for income, so you'll have other things going on, like the services that we're talking about, so it'll be a mix of,
or there might be shooting right in it. And the other thing, of course, to remember is that a lot of farms have a number of parcels of small woodland, and don't treat them as just discrete small woodlands. Actually, collectively, you might have quite a large parcel of woodland, and if you can manage them efficiently, then you can start to look at whether it be footpaths that link them all up together, or whether it's timber out of them. And then you can expand that further and say, well, actually I have a couple of small woodlands, and Joe next door has another 3, and Alice over there has 4, and all of a sudden we've got actually enough woodland to manage it as a bigger block. And that's exactly how Metzelita started, and Metzer are now the biggest global timber producing company in the world. And they were just a dozen small forest owners. As in small forest, like small forest owner.
Sure, yeah. We got that. So they put a cooperative together,
They
essentially?
put a cooperative together and grew and grew and grew. Yeah.
Nice. So complicated, yes and no.
Yeah.
Laurie was asking about rates for forestry, and if you could talk a bit around sort of what different people get paid. So particularly interested in self-employed cutters and forest workers.
Oh, difficult one. Well, according to Kath, who's about to become Timber Strategy's first employee, then not enough.
It's just my lifestyle. That's all.
All right, sorry. Sorry, we can't pay for your lifestyle. And yet, different areas, different places. I have to be honest, I don't have a list of sort of salaries in front of me. But I think the general consensus is probably underpaid. And especially if you start looking at harvester drivers. If anyone's ever seen inside a harvester, you will see how insanely complicated they are to drive, and not only are you having to manage both hands and both feet at once, do incredibly complicated things, but you're looking at what the quality of the tree is, you're cutting down, you're making decisions, and it's an incredibly highly skilled job that is, probably should be paid more, but that's not saying that, contractors should be paying their staff more. They should be, but culturally as a whole, the forest industry is probably underpaid. And that's about a wood culture in this country. It's about what this course is aimed at doing, which is trying to bring woodland into people's attention more. That's a roundabout way of saying I'm not really sure on exact rates.
And so the same applies for self-employed as well, you're saying? It's similar,
Yeah.
Hard to say exactly what those rates should be, but more than they are.
Yeah, but yes,
Sure.
which requires the timber price being more than it is, etc.
Yeah.
Etc. But I know we've got people from Inverness down to Herefordshire on tonight, and the rates will be seriously different all the way over.
Yeah. One final question I've got at the moment, which was from the studio, if that's okay, and it's looping back round to people being in your woods and stuff, and who is liable if something goes wrong? So somebody's come into your woods, maybe they've broken in, I don't know, trees fallen on them, branches fallen on them.
Oh, almost certainly you as the forest owner.
Not me.
Well,
I'm not
yet
responsible
you.
for everyone's woodlands.
Yeah, you are now.
It's a big responsibility. Okay, so anything that happens?
Pretty much, it's a legal minefield. Once you are the owner of a woodland, then your responsibilities extend quite a long way. So, some of it's quite obvious. If there's a right of access through your woodland and a branch falls on someone's head and injures them, and you haven't done a tree assessment that year on the safety of those trees, then it's clearly your fault. If you have trees overhanging roads, then it's your responsibility if they fall down. But then there's this whole grey area that if someone breaks in, then yes, the liability could very well be yours to deal with that. And that is when you're looking at offering forest services like walking or mountain biking, it's worth being aware of that and looking at whether you need people to sign disclaimers, or whether it's very popular in big forest owners to insist that people join a mountain bike club if there's informal riding there, and then they have an agreement with the mountain biking club which has its own insurance, etc., etc. But you have to put the cost of insurance into your profit and loss projections when you're looking at what the income from those services are.
Because so many things are out of your control. So if people come in and they have a little fire, that gets out of control and takes down some local buildings, that's on you?
Potentially.
Because you do see, don't you, signs up saying, don't have a fire, don't start fires. I mean, is that enough? If people are putting signs up, does that protect them?
It's like if someone climbs on a stack of wood that's on a forest site, and they fall over, or a log rolls down onto them and breaks their ankle, and I think that came up in court a while ago, whose responsibility is that? And I think it very rarely gets to that point. But it very rarely gets to that point because people have insurance to cover that. You need to demonstrate that you are doing everything you can to keep the woodland as safe for the people that use it as possible. And if you can demonstrate that, and the Forest Industry Safety Accord can help you a long way towards that. There's a lot of resources on their website. And if you have insurance in place, and if you show you're a responsible woodland owner with a management plan, then you're going a long way to mitigate that.
Okay.
It shouldn't be something to be afraid of.
Yeah, okay.
But it's something to be totally aware of.
Yeah, I was going to say, because that could get a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
We have another question. I'm going to check in on time. Have we got time for one more?
Go on, do it.
We're sneaking it in.
Yeah.
So this was from Mark, who's got small broadleaf woodland plot, 3 acres, wants to use it for helping small groups of people with mental health issues. Any idea of the kinds of hurdles that might need to go through to make that happen?
Well, one of the hurdles is that everyone with a small woodland wants to do that. And so it's quite a flooded market to do it. I'd be aware of that. I'm sorry to get harshly commercial about it, but what's your unique selling point to someone else doing it down the road? I mean, it should be something that is so normal now, like forest schools are so normalised now that virtually everyone can offer it. It's about insurance, it's about qualifications, it's about, I'd probably recommend you find an expert to bring those people, rather than you running it yourself. It's always more efficient and better to find an organisation that can bring those people in and manage it for you, so you're almost sort of letting part of your woodland out to those groups to come in. And then the other thing to think about is a more ecological aspect of it. But if you've got 3 acres and people are coming in, say, on a weekly basis and using one patch of that, let's say they're using, I don't know, 1/4 of an acre, the ground compaction will be quite a lot in that, and you'll find you'll need to move them around, every year or 2 years, if you can get away with it 3 years, but you will have to move them around to let the ground recover. It's like the insurance thing. It's sort of, there's problems with it. I could go on about issues forever, but actually it's an incredibly rewarding thing to do, and you follow it up for sure.
Great. I think that's it on questions for the moment. Thank you. Keep them coming in. We'll hand over.
Excellent.
And then we'll pick them up at the end, won't we?
Okay, yes, except it's you.
What? We're handing over to me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right then. Too many things going on. So we're getting into ecosystem services. So we've looked at products for people, and we've looked at like services for people and all that kind of stuff and all that paid stuff. But there's the other class of services, sort of the societal and the environmental group stuff that can also be paid. And the services that we've seen in the video generally are things that would be paid for through subsidies. The thing is with subsidies, because we're talking about services such as flood mitigation and planting for that kind of stuff, and purifying water, all that good stuff. At the moment, there's subsidies coming through that are covering that, but there's no way of knowing how long any subsidies are really going to last with a shift in climate. So with that in mind, we sort of end up with the question of will that service, if subsidies have gone, become a sellable or saleable item or service in the future? And that's kind of a question that we don't have an answer to. It's a big one. But if we get into the video, we can talk through a bit more of that stuff now. Let's start by looking at riparian zones. These woodlands and new plantings near rivers. We've talked a lot, quite a lot in past episodes, but here we're thinking about it in the form of how they provide an ecosystem service that might be fundable in some way or another. And to start with, let's look at water purity. So let's look at the fact that trees near rivers and streams are very good at filtering out not just sediments but chemicals as well. And this is attractive not just to people at the Environment Agency, but also to farmers and to water companies themselves, who perhaps one day will be prepared to pay a premium for you to plant woodland in these riparian zones to help offset the water quality costs. The other area is flood relief, and it's very well known and has been for very many years that planting woodland on floodplains, especially above towns and villages, can remediate water flow. So as river floods, in rain or storm events, then those banks into those flood zones will break and flood towns. But if we have zones above the towns that can buffer that water, as the water gets into the root and amongst the trees, the water flow is softened, it's lessened, and those areas can absorb a lot of, an awful lot of water. So the amount of water then coming downstream into urban areas is not just ameliorated in speed, but also in mass and in volume. Finally, in these riparian zones, obviously there's biodiversity element as well, and biodiversity is an ecosystem service all in itself, and it almost certainly is going to be something that is fundable not just through new environmental land management scheme, but it's likely that people will pay a premium for you to have biodiverse woodland. And of course, it's not just that this biodiversity element is all the treed landscape. This is about connecting fragmented woodland through hedgerows and shelter belts. It's about discrete farm woodland and how they can be connected up. It's also about new planting schemes that have, very rich biodiversity element. And it will also be about how you take monocultural crops and create a more resilient, dynamic, biodiverse woodland out of those. So that kind of leads us onto slope and to soil and to slope stabilisation. And if you go abroad to India and to other countries, the amount of soil erosion due to deforestation is extreme and causes huge problems, not just in the agriculture of the area, but the amount of sediment, being put into rivers going downstream. And we want to avoid that at all costs. And so planting trees, especially on steep slopes, helps us to stabilise those slopes. The roots stabilise the soil structure, and they also collect runoff and sediment coming from higher up in the catchment. And so this slope stabilisation suddenly becomes a fundable thing potentially. And suddenly these incredibly steep slopes that have had no use whatsoever originally, because it's something that you can now gain an income from. And then finally, let's have a look at the whole idea of the entire landscape as an ecosystem service, or as a piece of natural capital, if you like, and how in the future that might get funded. And trees form a completely integral part of all of our landscapes, and increasingly so, especially if you're in protected landscapes, and even in Cumbria, where the huge visual focus might be the mountains. Once you get into the valleys, and especially in the valleys of southern Cumbria, the woodland become a vital part of that landscape and that economy, and also tourism in the area. And it'll be interesting to see in the future how this can be captured more as a paid for service. And in some areas like the Woodland Enterprise Zone in North Cumbria, or the North Devon Biosphere down here, then that's beginning to be realised, and people can be paid for creating woodland that is part of that broad social, tourist, economic and biodiverse landscape. And that seems to be the direction that we're going in, with these ecosystem services that are paid for. And it's, how can the woodland contribute better to things which don't have an obvious income stream, but maybe ought to be paid for by the public?
And so we're going to spend the rest of the session almost wrapping up, really. I'm afraid the moments of Alice's stunning videos are almost over for this series, and we're going to finish off rather boringly with me mainly. And for those of you that have been here through all 5 sessions, first of all, thank you for joining us, but we've covered a lot of ground, and at the same time covered almost no ground at all. And it's one of the things that excites me quite a lot about forestry, is how little we know and can know. And last week I was with Esmond Harris, old forester, he's 96, and I was asking him what makes him motivated to still be interested in forestry, and he said, well, it's because of how little we actually know, and I know, and if there's a tiny thing I can contribute to someone else's knowledge, then I get excited about doing that. And we've covered 1/1,000,000% of what there is to know about woodland management and forestry and silviculture through this course, and it begs the question, where do you go from here? Where do you go for help, and we're going to look at sort of education and careers in a little bit. But let's, think a little bit about, on a very practical level, so I've got this woodland, what the hell do I do with it? Or, I walk through it every day, but I want to contact the owner. How do I do that? How do I even find someone to help me make the right decisions for this woodland? And it's a call we get day in, day out, and I know Cumbria Woodlands do, and that's why they're there and set up, is because people find it really difficult, even in this digital age, to find those right points of contact, those places to get help and to get knowledge. Now, it may be that you are just looking for an agent to give you advice, or an ecologist, but it may be that you just want to know more about the kind of things we've been talking about and getting deeper and deeper into woodland from a purely amateur interested basis. And so we're going to go into some video and just look at a few websites and type of places that provide the sort of backbone of next stage sort of skills development, if you like, from a sort of knowledge basis. So let's cut to some video. The Institute of Chartered Foresters is the professional membership organisation. If you're looking for a forest manager and want to ensure that they have the right qualifications, the right knowledge, that are backed up by ethical standards, then this is the place to look. And once you're into the website, a lot of it is about membership, but you can use the Find a Consultant tab to look for the type of consultant you want and the region you want. So the region's pretty obvious. Type of consultant, forest and woodland management or arboriculturalist for urban forestry kinds of things. And then you can look for specialisms and look what you want. The best thing to do is to look for a range of people in your area and speak to them all and find out who you want to work with. And then the next organisation we can go and have a look at is the Royal Forestry Society. So they have been around for a hugely long time, and they are a more generalist organisation, but hugely valuable if you want to learn about woodland. They have regional groups that have regular regional meetings and a series of online Zoom events, and they're made up of a whole mixture of people that includes owners of huge estates down to small woodlands, interested parties, professionals. It can be a vibrant way of learning about woodland and of getting insights, and they publish a fair amount of material, both collaborative with other people and by themselves. The quarterly journal is quite good. It's a sort of, science light approach. It's incredibly accessible for the vast majority of people. And then we have the Small Woodlands Association, and it kind of does what it says on the tin, really. It is a membership organisation for people who either own or are involved in small woodlands. And what you'll get with the Small Woodlands Association is that focus. So there won't be much about the sort of silviculture or the type of contracting you need in very large estates, but you will get a huge amount of information about how to go about things if you are in that small woodland sector. And then there is Conforth, Confederation of Forest Industries, and again, kind of does what it says on the tin. They're a membership organisation again, but I suppose for people within the forest industry sector. So this isn't just about forest owners, although there are a huge amount of forest and woodland owners in this, but they're all the nurseries are members, are certainly all the big nurseries, the big contracting organisations, the big sawmills, and they bring that sort of industry side together. And they also significantly do an awful lot of lobbying as well. So they have a dedicated lobbyist that works directly with government and the civil service to push the case for forestry and timber in its wider setting. And then finally, of course, it's worth mentioning that Cumbria Woodlands. And we are certainly really pleased to be working with Cumbria Woodlands. I started my life out with an organisation called Sylvanus that no longer exists, but it was a contemporary woodland initiative to Cumbria Woodlands that did much the same thing. And it's been fascinating and exciting to watch how Cumbria Woodlands has evolved over the years. And whilst obviously it has a geographical focus on Cumbria, the information on the website is applicable to almost everyone. And so there is information, for instance, if we go to tree health, there's resources, there's information on diseases that are around at the moment. We can go back, same with woodland management and wood fuel and tree planting. And part of what we're doing on this course is setting the scene and the basis for the next exciting development in Cumbria Woodlands, which is their learning management system, where they will host a whole load of different courses on a lot of the stuff we've been discussing in the last few weeks, but in a lot more detail. Let's turn then to not just about ways of finding help and knowledge, but what happens if you actually want to move into forestry as a career? And whether you're on this course out of pure interest or whether you think you want to move into forestry or woodland management as a career, obviously we would strongly urge you to think about it. It's, for me, an incredibly fulfilling place to work in. And we are desperately short of people coming into forestry. Crazy as it may seem, it's difficult to attract people into the industry. And Cumbria Woodland and Timber Strategies, amongst others, spend a lot of time trying to not just encourage people in, but make it easier or find ways for an avenue for people to come in to forestry as a career. And there's multiple ways in. You may want to move into forestry on a very practical basis. You may want to be a cutter, a feller. You're harvesting timber. You may want to move into it in terms of maintenance and ecological work. That ecological practical work may lead on to ecological management. You may want to be a silviculturalist and an agent managing other people's woodlands. And I think it's worth sort of spending some time right at the end of the evening looking at some of the people that we've talked to during this course and exploring how they've moved into forestry. Because I think one of the things that I'd really like to stress is that just because you are not in forestry already, just because you haven't got a forestry degree doesn't mean it's not something to come into. One of the things I hope we've really demonstrated in the last 5 weeks is just how diverse a subject it is. We can't even touch the sides, and we haven't even talked about forest engineering, or we haven't talked about research, or how to use digital aids in modern forestry. And all of these require different and modern skills as well. So the key thing is to, if you think forestry as a career is for you, is to try and be focused about it. And so many people think, well, I want to do a bit of management and that's going to be sort of writing management plans and silvicultural prescriptions, and then I'm going to go out into the woods and do it, and I might get a mobile sawmill and saw some timber as well. And that works for a very small number of people and works really well. But for most people, like any career, you just need to focus. Do I want to be a manager? Do I want to be a harvester driver? Do I want to be a sawmiller? And really focus on that. And so well, I'm going to start by talking about me, who did not focus on anything actually. But my background is in archaeology, and I spent a few years working abroad, not in forestry at all, and came back and did a master's degree in Aberdeen. And today doing a master's, either a distance master's or full-time at Bangor or Aberdeen or wherever it may be, is a very common way in. But I sort of became a generalist, and I involved in some woodland management with an interest in timber and construction timber, and that led to managing a large estate in Dorset for a school of architecture, and has led to me forming timber strategies now. And it's a fairly, I was going to say it's a fairly unusual way in, but actually increasingly it's not, and a lot of people we work with have come in a very similar way. So Kath, for instance, her route in is not from forestry at all, and actually a lot of her work will be to do with construction and timber, but having that forestry knowledge will be important for what she does. In total contrast, we've heard from Mike throughout the series, out in the woods, and I guess Mike took a more traditional route into forestry. His degree was in biology and ecology, and he moved into practical woodland management, and from there went on to, he had a real interest in new ways of silviculture and continuous cover forestry. And back in the day when no one talked about ecologically sensitive forestry, he was there banging a drum that no one listened to, and now of course is sitting there and people want his skills in how to manage woodland, and he's created a very successful sawmill and a very successful operation in very ecologically sensitive woodland. And the even more standard way of doing that is to go to university and do a degree in forestry and then become part of the Forestry Commission, the public forest sector, or the management companies. And there's still opportunities for that, but you do need to be enthusiastic. You need to want it, I guess. And it's one of those funny subjects that is actually, you have to devote quite a lot of effort to find the right courses for you and finding a way into doing it. But once you have found a way into doing it, is one of the most rewarding things you could possibly do. Certainly for me, on a daily basis, simple things like making a decision about what species to plant in a certain place, and thinking about what someone in 5 generations' time is going to think of that decision that you make today, I find quite humbling and quite intense and incredibly rewarding. I mean, let's hope they'll think it was kind of rewarding. But that sort of, I suppose, covers how you might move into it. And then the other thing to say, as a full-time career, the other thing to say is, if you're not in forestry, that increasingly forestry impacts on almost everything. If you're a chemist in the biochemicals industry, then soon enough forestry is going to be impacting on you because you're going to be using bio-based materials. If you're a road engineer, then actually the number of trucks coming in and out of forestry will affect your decisions in your professional career. And for almost everyone in the future, knowing something about woodlands and being part of that woodland culture is going to be absolutely vital. And on that note, I am, with trepidation, going to ask Kath to come back up, because I think we're due another Q&A session. Kath's not very good at getting on these chairs. Sometimes she just pushes me straight off the other side.
Well, in my defence, the chairs are 8 foot high and I'm about 2 foot tall, so, I've got a step, luckily. Gareth's provided me with a step. That was graceful. You didn't fall off, I made it.
It was almost graceful.
I'm proud. I'll celebrate my successes even if you won't. Are we in? I've got
We're
Q&A.
in.
I've got
Excellent.
most of them, but yeah, there's quite a few coming through. Where did we get to? So we had lorries. So, Smojo Music. I think you're called Dave. I can't remember. I know you've told me in previous sessions, but the chats don't save, so apologies for just giving you a generic Dave name. Was asking about shade-tolerant species. So he's got an area of pause that's protected ancient woodland.
Plantation on ancient woodland.
Damn it, close, so close. 6-year-old sycamore that they're currently thinning. They want more diversity in that mid-story. So is there shade-tolerant species or speci that you would... I don't think that works, but...
Most species are shade tolerant to some extent. So, for instance, I was about to say ash, but clearly no one's going to be planting ash
Maybe
right at the moment.
Now.
No, but oak, for instance, is shade tolerant for its first, say, 10 to 15 years. You know, it can quite happily grow on. You see so many little oak seedlings in the woods, and then you never see any mid-size oak, and it's because they become incredibly demanding as they get older. But that's fine because you're thinning the sycamore, and actually as you're going round, you can keep thinning out. And then don't ignore the conifer species. You know, it could be that you are planting something like western red cedar. Sequoia is very shade tolerant. Certainly the ones in Dartington are incredibly shade tolerant. Plant a load of species and experiment and see what's going to work for you, because depending on how much you're thinning out, it might not need to be that shade tolerant at all. And also don't forget the sycamore's fantastic timber. Yeah, it's worth growing some on.
Plug for sycamore there.
Yeah.
Great. Alec was saying they've got 10 acres of spruce that's come down in this recent storm, that Storm Arwen. Some of it's wind snapped, and they're wondering, can it still be used for sawn timber, or are those damages going to cause weaknesses, fractures, that kind of stuff?
Really sorry to hear about that. And if people don't know and have damage from Storm Arwen, then Cumbria Woodlands did last Thursday when we were gallivanting around, skiving off. They did a special feature on Storm Arwen and the repercussions of it that's probably worth listening to. But we've tried sawing wind-snap timber before, and just don't bother. You might get a little bit out of it. If you can get it out, you can dry it for chip, for biomass. You know, the estate I worked on in Dorset, we dried quite a lot for self-supply of wood chip. If the whole root plates come down, if it's wind throw rather than wind snap, so the whole root is now sticking in the air, then it depends on the impact with the ground and whether it's shattered or not. If it hasn't shattered, then yeah, potentially you can get timber out of it. But clearing storm damage is a very highly skilled job and can be very dangerous. Get good contractors in, and with care you might get some out, but it's unlikely. It's back to the insurance question again, and whether you get insured for storm damage, if you still can these days.
Just thinking about other uses then, so if there's timber in there that's no good for the sawmill, can it go for sculpture and greenwood working and things like that?
Well, if it's big conifer, not
so
really.
Okay.
And actually, why not? We're fairly obsessed about tidiness. I am. But actually, our woodlands don't have to be that tidy.
Yeah.
And if you've got some in there, well, possibly some of it can be left.
Yeah.
As deadwood.
Habitat.
It's habitat. It's deadwood. It'll eventually rot down. It'll provide soil health. If some of it's fallen across a river or a stream, then as long as it's not causing downstream impacts, then actually leave it. It's a different set of habitats. Things don't have to be tidy all the time. But yes, it can be a significant loss of potential future income. And we haven't touched at all on cash flows and balance sheets and profit and loss, and how that on earth you can predict potential income from woodlands in the future. And it's a sort of specialist subject that we could talk about for hours. But if you have storm damage, then that income that you thought you would get in is now clearly not there anymore. and it's potentially an increasing risk as we get more and more storms. But that's about your silviculture and your management and your species choice and how you manage that woodland. Is back to what's shade tolerant amongst the sycamore and how many species you put in your woodland.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
We have a question from Philip, who is saying, while there are trees growing, you might be offering ideal habitat to rare species. Can that, the existence of rare species, can that impact when you might fell?
Oh yeah, totally. Yes. Yeah. And they're not even rare species, even common species. So, the most obvious one is bird nesting season. You shouldn't fell during bird nesting season, and you should be very well aware of whether there's rare birds of prey in your woodlands, whatever they are, will have an impact on when you can and can't. And it's fair to say that most people probably don't know what's in their woodlands. And it's probably fair to say that for some less scrupulous people, they don't want to know what's in their woodland. I mean, who wants to know if there's something rare in your woodlands if it means you can't do anything in it? But actually, once you do know, that is a really important part of your forest management. And yeah, it'll have an impact, but you can always work around it. No one's really losing income from bird nesting restrictions. We just adapt, and that's
we came
how.
across it yesterday, didn't we? Chap we met yesterday said they've got goshawks now nesting, and they were just working in that area, so they got notified and had to stop.
Yes,
somewhere
just
else.
before they felled the nest, I think. But
it happens.
He should, yes. And in that case, the goshawks had just moved in, and he was an owner who was very well aware of the ecology of his woodlands and very well motivated by his woodland ecology. But everything evolves and changes, so you need to keep monitoring it. Yeah.
Great. Daniel's asking, with the seeming scale of the challenge in managing woodlands for 100 and plus years, talking sort of uses, accesses, monitoring, funding, on and on, how do you not feel overwhelmed at the task and just end up doing nothing?
If you'd spoken to me half an hour before we started this evening, in the state I was in, you would have seen someone completely overwhelmed.
Same.
You have to pick your fights, don't you? I think it's truly exciting career to be in, and even if you're just an interested party and an amateur, it can be overwhelming, but it can be hugely rewarding as well. It's difficult to answer, really, because I've always just found that kind of thing exciting. I mean, we could be making completely the wrong decisions every day. And, I suppose, thankfully, we'll be dead when anyone notices those decisions.
Yeah, few. That's lucky.
But we hope we're making the right decisions, and we think we're making the right decisions for future generations. And that's a very rewarding way of looking at it, that what you're doing is trying to make a better future for someone in some small way.
I think on a similar vein, I had a conversation with Alan MacDonald from Trees for Life recently, which are incredible. They do amazing work in Scottish Highlands, and he phrased it really nicely for me and just said that it's not an option to not be optimistic, which I really liked. I was like, that's what helps you get up every day and keep going, because it can seem so overwhelming, but what else have we got? It's that or straight neat despair. And
Mike put it really nicely as well, actually. He talked about how as a forester you have to have a feeling of immortality, and he didn't mean that in an arrogant way, but in a way that you have to look way past your own lifetime in the actions that you take. I really like that sentiment. I'm just scanning for other questions, as there's been a lot of chat about sharing resources, and I can see Neville's in on that. So people want to know if we can share books, websites, resources that we've gone through all of the sessions. So I think if the boss is covering that,
I think they're grabbing that with the learning management system. So sorry, I'm trying to read and talk. I think. Question.
Well, we're being told we can't take any more.
Oh, are we? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, I think
we can take one small one, but we're allowed one small one apparently. If there
I'm
are
just
any.
skipping back. So Philip was saying his question was in relation to commercial growers. Oh, and okay, so it was Philip that was asking about felling around rare species. Same applies for commercial growers, though, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, we shouldn't even be making a differentiation. Commercial growing, ecological management, we sort of silo all these things, and actually, perhaps is a good point to finish on is the point that we need to stop siloing different types of forestry. A properly resilient forest is providing for the ecology, it's providing for the soil health, it's providing for the community, and it's providing materials as well. And all of those things are important. You shouldn't silo a commercial forest from a non-commercial one. We should be trying to be resilient and sustainable in all woodland, and that includes rare species and habitats.
I think that's it. I think that's us on questions. I think that's
excellent, and that's almost us for the series.
Yeah.
And it has been an absolute pleasure doing it. When Cumbria Woodlands and Neville approached us, I think I probably brazenly said, yeah, no problem, we'll do that. How hard can it possibly be? And the answer is actually quite difficult. Who knew? Except for Alice, who told us right at the start. But I think from our point of view, we'd like to thank the Forestry Commission firstly, because they have helped fund this, and it's been quite an innovative way of doing things. We hope it's been successful and rewarding, and that you've got something out of it. And we'd certainly like to know if there's things we should have done better, things we could have done, however, do fill in the feedback or get in touch directly with Cumbria Woodlands. I just realised I probably shouldn't have said that. Email Cumbria Woodlands directly.
Or Timber Strategies.
No. And so, it was a brave move by the Forestry Commission to allow us to do this. And we, as a team, would like to thank Cumbria Woodlands especially for giving us the opportunity and trusting us with the baby, so to speak, and we hope they feel it's been successful. I'd like to thank, before I completely forget, I don't want to make this sound like the Oscars or anything, the Forest Schools video we used before was provided by an organisation called Old Skills New Ways, and huge thanks for them to letting us use that. It's not easy getting video images of forest schools, yet it's such an important part of forestry today. Gareth, Creative Engagement Group, the tech behind this, we just could not possibly have done by ourselves. And it's been amazing, made the process so easy. Same for Alice as well, who's provided all the film for this.
She's still learning to count.
And she is still learning to count down from 5.
She's getting there.
If there's any pauses, it's because of that. And Kath, of course, but who, has stepped in.
Turned up and did what he could. And to you for holding it all together, clearly.
Well, I just sat here and sort of wittered on. But I think mostly we'd like to thank you, the viewers, because actually, although we're talking to a sort of camera screen, knowing there's people out there listening and enjoying it is hugely important. And these videos will carry on being available, and they will be on, what's Cumbria Woodland? Canopy.
That's what I've got.
If you go to Cumbria Woodland's website, you will be able to get onto the platform where all of their courses are going to be. And not just these, but much more technical involved courses, and that's going to grow and grow, and all the resources you want is going to be on there. It's worth going and checking it out, signing up and registering for it. But yes, we'd just like to finish by thanking you for tuning in for the last 5 weeks. And I think we're going to leave with some of our favourite bits, rolling on some of our favourite bits of film. And have a good Christmas. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.